Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to give everyone just a second here to get connected. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Michaela Schmidt, an outreach coordinator here at the Pulitzer Center. If you haven't joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization dedicated to raising awareness of underreported global issues. Last year, we supported 275 reporting projects in collaboration with journalists, filmmakers, and news outlets around the world. We also work with classrooms and communities to extend the impact of journalism and cultivate public engagement with these issues globally. You can learn a bit more about our work in our 2022 annual report. We are so excited to be hosting this event today in collaboration with the Trans Journalists Association. I'm going to hand it over to Kay, a co-founder of TJA, to tell you a bit more about it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming. Our organization launched in 2020, and we offer a lot of resources to anyone interested in reporting on trans topics. Check out our style guide. We're working on a large-scale revision that will be coming later this year, so keep an eye out for that. We also have some employer best practices guides, and we offer trainings to newsrooms and are also always happy to talk on or off the record about trans coverage issues, connect you with somebody who has expertise in a particular reporting area. So, if you're coming to this webinar, it's not the end of the discussion about how to cover trans issues right now. So, use us as a resource and call us if you're covering trans issues and have some questions. We have a contact email, contact@transjournalist.org. And if you're looking to hire a trans journalist, we also have a jobs board at jobs@transjournalist.org. And if you're trans, non-binary, or otherwise gender expansive, you can join the org for access to professional resources, internal trainings, networking, and to also collaborate on the creation of all these resources. We try to bring in as many perspectives and expertise from as many trans journalists in as many areas of media as we can. Well, thank you all for coming, and gonna hand it over to the rest of our very smart panelists.
Thank you so much, Kay. We're also really excited to be hosting a meet and greet in partnership with TJA on August 17th. So trans, non-binary, and gender expansive journalists are invited to a virtual coffee chat with Pulitzer Center senior editor Boyoung Lim to learn a bit more about our grant opportunities and tips on how to craft a successful pitch that would help fund your dream project. I'm going to share the link to the registration page here in the chat. It will ask if you are trans or non-binary. This allows us to ensure that it's a space specifically for members of the community. So we'd love for you to join us for this casual conversation just to learn a bit more about us and what we do. A few logistics before we begin our conversation. You'll see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You can begin adding your questions for your speakers at any time throughout this discussion. There's also a chat icon on the screen where you can share thoughts and specific tech issues that you may be encountering. We also wanted to let you know that we are recording the session and it'll be posted online following the event. I'm now really excited to introduce our panelists for today. Gina Chua is executive editor at Semaphore, a new global news startup. Prior to joining Semaphore, she was executive editor at Reuters, where she oversaw newsroom operations, logistics, budget, safety and security, and worked with technology team to develop newsroom tools. Gina was also the editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post and the Asian Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong, a deputy managing editor at the Wall Street Journal in New York, a foreign correspondent in Singapore, Manila, Hanoi, and a television and radio journalist in Singapore. Graf Massara is a freelance journalist based in San Francisco. Graf is the editor of the Transgender Journalists Association Style Book. He was most recently a fact checker with the Associated Press, where he also contributed to the AP Style Book's entries on LGBTQ+ terminology. Prior to that, he was a newsletter editor at Politico. Kate Sosin is the LGBTQ+ reporter at the 19th, reporting on gender, transgender rights, incarceration, politics, and public policy. Kate has conducted deep dive investigations into transgender prison abuse and homicides for NBC News. They previously worked at Logo TV, INTO, and Windy City Times. And finally, moderating our conversation today is Kallie Cox, a Pulitzer Center grantee and 2020 and 2021 Reporting Fellow. Kallie covers public safety for the Charlotte Observer. They studied political science and journalism at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. I'm now going to hand it over to Kallie and our panelists for our conversation today.
Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into these questions. And my first question today is for you, Kate, and then Gina and Graf, please jump in as you feel comfortable. So what are some best practices journalists can use to better cover the trans community and to treat coverage in the community not as issues, but more as human focused stories?
Yeah, well, thank you, Pulitzer Center, for having me and all of us. I'm so excited to join you all today and have this conversation. I think that's a great place to start, Kallie. When I talk about reporting on trans people, I like to bring us back to the things that we know about reporting generally, right? Like, I like to take us back to speaking truth to power and holding a line at our dignity and humanity of all of our sources and subjects, and just really bringing it back to that. I think a lot of times when we when we have a marginalized community that we don't know very much about, we start to really run in circles about how do we report on these folks. We just don't know. We have so much to learn and overcomplicate it. But I think when we report on trans folks, just like any other community, we really have to take like a human-centered approach and sit back and say, okay, where's the story here? What is the community telling us? And listen. And I think the same is true for trans folks. So what I like to tell people is, where is the dignity and humanity, and where is the conflict? And it's not whether or not someone is a person, whether or not someone should have access to basic rights like going to the bathroom, or accessing healthcare, or being able to participate in society. Those are not things that we as journalists debate, and we know that. The other questions are, what does it mean to live in this world where those things are up for grabs? And so I think that when we start to get to the humanity of those questions, then we do much better, more interesting and complicated work.
Thank you for that. And then Gina, Graf, would either of you like to weigh in on that question?
I mean, I think Kate said it really well. I think, the question I think you want to ask yourself whenever you're writing a story about the community is, whose voice is centered in this, or whose experience is centered in this, and you can see. So and that's not 100% always the case. You're covering a vote. Okay, fine. Then the people who are voting are the story, but even then you still have to remember who the vote is affecting. And you can see this in stories, especially about trans minors, where oftentimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly, the voices that you hear are the voices of the parents, not of the children. And you hear and you see their fears, you see their questions, you see their concerns, and that's not to say those are illegitimate fears and questions. I mean, I'm a parent too. I understand what it's like to have a child that you worry about. But the story isn't about ultimately the parents, the story is about the children. And you have to try and put as much effort as you can into understanding what it's like to be that child, not to be what that parent is thinking about that child.
Thank you. And then shifting gears a little bit, Graf, this next question is for you. And then Gina, Kate, please feel free to weigh in as well. So what are some of the biggest and most common mistakes you see journalists and editors making as they cover the trans and non-binary community?
I feel like the running theme you're going to hear in this session a lot is apply the best practices you would to anything else. It's really journalism, generally speaking. I mean, like obviously we're having a session, there are some specific concerns to keep in mind, but ultimately a lot of them only come up because people aren't used to, haven't covered this community before, are hesitant and might have more questions than normal, but like a lot of journalism 101 things still apply. And I think a lot of some of the pitfalls that people can run into, I don't want to say that it's because they're overthinking it, but they sort of diverge from like standard issue best practices. In going over the style book, I find myself so often just like pointing to other style books, or like the AP style book, for example, or like other like the SPJ's standards, just like really, really basic stuff that I feel like sometimes can get overlooked. And I'm trying to think of more specific examples, but a lot of it is issues of framing, I have to say. I think there was, if you'd asked me this question like 3 or 4 years ago, I probably would have said something along the lines of, well, make sure you know, double check the pronouns you use for people, and like, you know, make sure you're using the correct names, and like fairly surface level copy editing stuff. But generally, I feel like there's at least some recognition that that's something you need to be careful of now. Unfortunately, that doesn't stop some of those broader framing questions from coming into play. And ultimately, when there are stories that have more structural issues with like who you're quoting, or like in what context you're quoting them, or like perceptions, I don't want to say of like false bias, but like, you know, quoting someone who's verifiably not an expert on something like endocrinology on endocrinology as if they were an expert, and not bothering to fact check what they're saying if it's true or not. Those types of things aren't really copy editing questions. Those are more fundamental reporting issues that I wish were easier to fix in post, so to speak. But I feel like, I mean, this is sort of why I, as an editor, want to like feel so strongly about all this stuff, is that ultimately these are calls that have to get made sort of earlier in the production process. But yeah, I don't know. It's all variations on the same stuff that you can get, you know, that affects really any type of hard news reporting. Yeah, please jump in if anyone has further thoughts.
So I think one of the issues that I find with trans coverage is frankly an issue that suffuses a lot of other coverage as well, which is the notion of normality and what is normal, right? And a plane takes off, that's normal, plane crashes, and so that's a story. The problem is that for all of us, we all have different normals. Kate's got a different normal from me, and Graf has a different normal from me. And so what we think of, and news is defined as what is out of the ordinary, what is abnormal. And so we tend to look at things that are abnormal to us as stories without necessarily considering whether they're abnormal to other people, or that something that's normal to us is abnormal to other people. And so I think that's sort of one of the original sins of story assignment, which is like, hey, I just saw that out my window, let's get a reporter on it, as opposed to sort of really thinking through what are the issues and what really matters. And so one of the questions when I give a talk, one of the questions I ask the room now, and I'd ask it virtually here, except it's not possible, is like, how many of you went through puberty, right? And 99.4% of you did, and 0.6 of you did not. And 0.6 is a pretty small number, but the point is still that puberty is normal for people, and so it's completely normal for cis people to say, well, what's wrong with that? And the answer is that for 0.6 of the population, maybe 5% of a different cohort, it's a huge issue. And so the stories that you tend to see about trans care for minors are framed around, how do we prevent a mistake? How do we prevent someone who mistakenly takes puberty blockers, mistakenly gets cross-sex hormones, mistakenly gets surgery, from having a bad life? And so you tend to see a story where there's one person who had that intervention and is happy, and one person who didn't have the intervention and is unhappy, but that is not the right population. The right population is the people who didn't get interventions, some of whom maybe are happy and happily making a mistake, and some of whom are desperately unhappy. And so you see a story. I wrote a letter to a publication and said, like, look, you've talked about this person who's desperately unhappy because she is now stuck with a body that they can't abide, and they have a voice that they can't stand, and everything. I said, who else has that experience? All the people that didn't get puberty blockers and who are now stuck in bodies that they also don't recognize. And so I just want us to sort of think through what it means when we talk about stories like this, to ask ourselves what are the populations. You would not do a story about vaccine safety and profile a person who got a vaccine and is happy, and a person who got the vaccine and has terrible side effects and is desperately unhappy, and then ignore the population of people who did not get a vaccine and say, well, I guess I've done my work here, right? So part of it is just having this broader frame and understanding what it is that you know, that makes up the population you're talking about, and then understanding, even frankly, leaving aside all of the things that Graf has said about getting the right experts, is about just following the logical arguments through. You don't need to be an expert on trans care to ask yourself, are these two people the right people to profile? Because it's a question of logic. It's not difficult. You can be a complete ignoramus, and I could tell you that that is the wrong set of people to profile already. Sorry, a little passionate about that.
Oh, thank you for weighing in. And then, Kate, did you have anything to say on that question before I move on?
No, I think that was beautifully put in. Thank you.
And then, Gina, to kind of expand on some of what you were just talking about, what should newsrooms keep in mind as they think about the story selection, and what journalists and editors think about as they frame some of these stories about in the community? I know you just mentioned it being pretty logical, but can you just kind of expand on that a little?
All right, I'll add one more logic question, and then I'll talk a little bit more at sort of the newsroom level as opposed to report level. So, you know, there was another story from a publication, which I will not name, which had two issues in it. One, it sort of said the US is out of sync with practices for trans care for minors from Europe, and it's, you know, increasingly diverging, which is true. And there's nothing factually wrong with the story, except for the fact that, you know, it didn't ask the question, like, maybe European countries are diverging for political reasons, and they didn't ask that question. There's an implicit assumption that those were being done for good medical reasons. Now, that may or may not be true, but they didn't ask the question, and as a reader of the story, I wouldn't know. But more importantly, when you frame a story that way, there's an implication that the US is drifting away from best practice. I mean, why don't you do a story about how New York is drifting away from standards of care as practiced by Florida? You wouldn't do that. But that's exactly what the story is. If you don't ask the question of why does Florida have different standards of care from New York, and frame it, you could just as well frame it as Florida is drifting away from New York standards of care, and you have to choose something. And ideally, don't choose either of those, but that's one thing. The other point in the story was it had a line that said, you know, critics have pointed out that of children who start puberty blockers, something like 98% go on to cross-sex hormones. And they quoted a critic as saying that shows, or that's a danger that shows that children are being locked into a path that they might not want, without looking at the opposite argument, which is maybe the screening is so good that only 2% of people are misdiagnosed and given puberty blockers, right? I mean, again, it's a logic. These are just logic questions. It doesn't require great knowledge, but it shows essentially what the blind spots are. I don't want to say hidden biases, but they're just blind spots in the editors and the reporters. And so, you know, just to sort of take that step back, which is really about the assigning process, a lot of the stories that we have certainly been looking at are enterprise or enterprising stories, that they are stories that somebody decided was worth spending time on. They weren't like a breaking news story and you suddenly have to go out and write it. It's like somebody said, you know, let's take a reporter, have them not report on this, but report on that instead. And again, that's fine. That's some of the best work that comes out of newsrooms, is when we decide what it is that we want to report. But when you look at the mix of the stories that have come out, you have to ask yourself, was that really the best use of what limited resources your newsroom has? There's 500 bills around the country targeting the trans community. And yes, there are stories about them, but when you compare the wordage of the stories about everything else against the wordage of what is actually happening to what I would argue is one of the biggest rollbacks of civil rights and human rights in this country, it's astonishing that they aren't, you know, 5,000 word features about that every other day in papers across the country. So, you know, a lot of it is sort of sitting back and saying, what is it that motivates us to want to use our reporting resources on a story? What are the big stories here? And I think you can fix some of those questions by getting out of the newsroom and asking people, I want to write about trans issues. What are the trans issues I should think about? And I assure you that if you ask most of us, they would not be, we need another 5,000 words about trans care for minors and whether puberty blockers are safe.
And I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up question based on what you said, and this is open to all three of you. What are some of the issues that reporters aren't really focusing on right now that we should be focusing on instead of just, sports, transitioning, puberty? What are some ideas?
I'm not going to talk. Somebody else should talk.
What do you want me to jump in? There's endless stories. I feel like I could report all day. Yeah, someone said happy, well-adjusted trans people doing the work. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of people have asked for stories about trans joy, and that's like supposed to be, I think, what balances this out. And I agree, but I think there's something in between, which is just trans people who don't have to be joyful or sad. Just stories about trans people existing who don't have to either be fighting a fight or like living their best lives. And then also just like, I want to know about trans voter disenfranchisement. I want to know about, trans people and job discrimination. I want to know about the fact, I have a gender marker X on my ID, which a lot of people think is a bad idea because, that misaligns with every bathroom that I go to publicly and every facility and every form that I have to fill out. And how is it that my state is issuing these gender markers and hasn't updated literally anything else? How is it that, our systems don't account for the fact that we exist yet? There are endless stories about the fact that we live in a binarily gendered system wherein trans people literally don't exist and cannot exist. And we don't report on those. The fact that all of these anti-trans bills are coming through mostly are targeting trans kids in states where mostly trans kids are not even trying to play sports. They're trying to like get through the day. And we're talking about this like savior, sort of like the idea of a white kid, I think, in a lot of these states, in southern states. And the result is that we're seeing a massive uptick in trans homicides of women of color in metropolitan areas. And we are not talking a lot about the increase of violence on mostly Black trans women, right? What does that mean? And so those anti-trans bills, that rhetoric has real consequences, and it's not on the people that we're talking about. And so, there's endless stories. I don't even know where to start. Literally any other story. Gina, Graf, I don't know.
To Kate's point, I think it's important that that's why we encourage people to not be afraid to cover this population. There are so many stories that involve trans people. They're not the obvious things, but I have to say that a lot of times some of the, for smaller local outlets especially, I think there's a lot to work with here. That every anti-trans policy that is at the state level, there's going to be local impacts of that. That there's a lot of these sort of debates about education, for example, and inclusivity of LGBTQ topics in schools. Those fights happen at local school board meetings, and there's just to your point, I think there's a lot of ways to localize some of those national stories, and those are going to manifest differently depending on the nuances of your own individual media market, that they're going to play out differently in where I come from, conservative rural Northern California versus SoCal versus, anywhere else in the country. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to work with. It's like any other minority population, we face particular difficulties, but also are just are facing this extreme scrutiny that, is kind of novel. And yeah, I feel like I'm just following in your two footsteps, but there's a lot to work with. I don't want people to feel boxed into like, you have to report on like either like trans kids fleeing your state or like find some like specifically defined type of like trans joy, happy, fluff piece. That there's a lot more in between, just like with anything else.
Yeah, I wanna sort of speak on both sides of my mouth on this one, which is I do think that it's important to cover us as normal people. And I think we go out of our way to say we don't want positive coverage. We want better coverage, right? We all care about things that affect our lives, and we care about our place in the world. And they don't have to be about how great we all are, how we're all doing wonderfully. And nor do they have to be about how we're all victims, because I think victimization of populations is equally bad. I think one thing that certainly Graf has raised and will be raising in the revised style guide is that we're not all defined by transness or gender identity. We're just normal people, and we have lots of other areas of interest, lots of other expertise, and and by all means, please have us in your stories, and let's talk about that without having to dwell on how our transness. The other thing I want to say, and it's slightly less about what stories you should cover, but a little bit about the framing of questions about transition and about trans joy or happiness or whatever, is that we tend to write, and we're just as guilty of this, I think, as much as everybody else. We tend to write about transition as an outcome-based decision. We tend to say, well, you should let the kids do this because it will lead to reduced suicide rates or greater mental health. And look, by and large, if you actually dig into the research, it does. But my thought on this is that look, if it does or it doesn't, it's not the critical point, right? I mean, people tell me I'm happier since I transitioned, and I smile more and I talk more, as you can see, and I'm more outgoing and I'm more creative and all that. And none of that matters, right? Because I could be unhappy, I could be grumpy, I could be miserable, my life could be worse, but I didn't do it for any of those reasons. I did it to be me. And we don't frame enough stories around autonomy, which is really what I think a lot of this is. It's about making decisions about your life and living with the consequences, good or bad. And I do think that that's one of the things we should think about as we frame stories and we talk to people about it, that it's frankly not that important whether they are happier after transition or not. It is that they made a decision and they should have the right to make that decision.
Thank you all for weighing in on that. I kind of want to switch gears just a little bit here in the interest of time. And I wanted to ask all of you, why aren't more trans and non-binary reporters working in local newsrooms? And what can industry leaders do better as a whole to hire and retain them? And this is open to all of you, so whoever wants to go first.
This is something I
go
feel
first. Yeah, go.
I really am passionate about this, and I hope that one thing that we all take from this is that if you're working in a newsroom and you don't have trans colleagues, that we can all push our newsrooms to do better on this, because we need trans people in newsrooms. I think that historically, and I don't know if this has been other people's experience, but for me, a lot of people looked at me and they were like, "You're a trans person, you want to cover LGBTQ plus issues, like you have a bias there, right?" I think a lot of us have heard that, or like that has been the assumption. And I think a lot of that is changing now. Like, we understand that when people come from communities that they cover, they are actually more likely to be experts. And more likely to have trust within those communities, and that's can be a superpower, right? It can be really helpful. And that is changing. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of job discrimination, discrimination in education, structural discrimination that prevents trans people from entering newsrooms, and just very few of us are employed full time in newsrooms. We have a ton of freelancers. I know Kay has the numbers on this, and Gina, maybe you do too. How many people are part of the Trans Journalists Association now? It's
a
700?
couple hundred at least.
Yeah, it's more than 600, 750 right now. Yeah. And I can I rattle off, probably just sitting here, how many of us are employed full-time in newsrooms. So there's just such a disparity, and that is something we really need to work on. It would change media.
I mean, I have a different experience because obviously I was in newsrooms for a long time, and then I transitioned, and it's pretty hard for them to fire me at that point, especially since I ran the budget. Look, I mean, I think it's a classic issue, and it's not necessarily confined to trans people. It's confined to anybody who is different from the newsroom's main demographic, because people, it's a well-known fact. People hire people like themselves. It's, and again, it's not necessarily even conscious bias. A lot of it's just unconscious. And, as when I was, helping make hiring decisions in newsrooms, and the one thing I always told hiring managers is, if you can anonymize as much of this process as possible, you will get better candidates, and you will get surprising candidates. You want to hire a copy editor, have an anonymized copy editing test. Now, maybe that's not everything you want. Maybe you need to, maybe they need to be managing people, so you need to know a bit more about their managing style, and maybe you can't anonymize that. But the more you can anonymize, the more you will be surprised at what you get, and you will often get better people than you would otherwise get. There's a very famous statistic about how American orchestras back in, so I'm going to make up the numbers, so just don't take them as gospel. American orchestras were, something like 25% women, and the way you would hire, a new first violin or whatever would be that they would come in, they would play, and the best musicians in the orchestras would listen, and then they would pick the best musician. And then they put blind auditions in. They put a curtain up, so you couldn't see who was playing. They made them take off their shoes, so you couldn't even hear what shoes they were wearing. They would come in, they would play. And then American orchestras became 50% women. And they weren't trying to hire women. They were trying to hire the best player based on their ear. And so, if we can get out of our own way, we will hire better people, and we will give more opportunity to people. So that's my best advice, is like, just stop doing face-to-face interviews and screen people through some kind of anonymous system, and you will get better candidates.
This isn't exactly an answer to the question that you asked, so forgive me for that. But so sort of the flip side to the question of like, oh, can a trans person cover trans issues without injecting their own personal feelings into their coverage? Like, the sort of corollary to that is that, speaking for myself and for a lot of the TJA membership, we didn't really want to do the trans beat. Certainly that wasn't my vocational interest when I first got into journalism. And a lot of us, if we're the only trans person in our newsroom, feel sort of like, if I don't do it, it's not going to get done, or it's going to get done poorly, and I don't want that. And so some of this, I feel like, is as having the rest of the newsroom, the cis majority in the newsroom, get more comfortable covering trans issues. I feel like that will make it's like a bit less of a burden on the trans people that you hire to have to cover that themselves. They'll be able to expand their journalistic repertoire in the same way that cis journalists get to, and we don't sort of feel like we have to pigeonhole ourselves. And that, of course, helps us all build resumes and, go on in our careers, et cetera, et cetera. The only other thing, and I hate to bring this up, but it sort of occurred to me the other day, is that when I personally have been, I'm freelancing for now, but when I personally have been looking at listings, there are whole states I have to rule out, because if I were to work there, my insurance would be constrained by that state's rules. So it's just something for managers and HR people to keep in the back of their minds, that even if I want to work for, somewhere based in a state that might not be friendly towards me, that you might want to consider expanded remote accommodations, or figuring out some workaround for insurance type things that, it's just something that I'm sure that trans applicants will be thinking about if you're you know, a newsroom is based in a red state. It's unfortunate, but it's a reality. And that's also probably where you're going to want to have a trans reporter on staff. Like, it's all the more important if your state is sort of a battleground for these types of things, that you have someone who's at least well versed in it, if not, you know, their specialty per se. But, you know, it's this sort of catch-22. So I don't have a magic wand solution for that. Just, I feel like, as you know, that a lot of us who are freelancers, you know, who come from non-traditional journalism backgrounds, sometimes do so out of pure necessity, not because we have any, you know, dislike of the mainstream media apparatus, so to speak. So just, you know, keep an open mind about those types of particular considerations, in addition to what Gina said about just expanding your general applicant pool and being mindful that, you know, you might be surprised where you find talent.
And I'm glad that you mentioned journalists who can't work in red states, because there are still some who do, and I'm sure that they encounter a lot more hate than some of us in other states. And so I wanted to ask generally, what is y'all's advice to young LGBTQ plus journalists, even those not in red states, who are just encountering a lot of hate on a daily basis at their jobs and outside of their jobs? What advice or encouragement do you have for them?
There's some basic things that you can do to protect yourself. If you haven't already, I would recommend, if you have a newsroom that will pay for it, or if you are able to get on Delete Me. It's a service that will wipe you from the internet, including like your phone number, your address, identifying information about you and your family. And if you're a person, especially who's on social media or has any kind of presence and is reporting on sensitive issues, and you come from a marginalized community, it is really helpful to have that information removed. It will scrub, I think, upwards of 60 websites and take your information off. And that's something I would recommend mostly to basically any reporter. And then I personally have scaled back most of my social media presence, and I don't post things like photos close to anywhere I live, photos of my family. I'm really careful about even posting pictures of like my partner or kids. It's called Delete Me. Yeah. I'll type it out here. Delete Me. And any kind of personal identifying information, if I'm at an event and I want to post a picture at the event, I will not post it until after I leave the event. I don't know, other security best practices, two-factor authentication on everything. I use 1Password for everything, or another password manager, in order to protect all my stuff. I don't know, do you all want to add stuff about that?
I mean, I'll add it more from a sort of a newsroom point of view. You know, when I was at Reuters, they put in a pretty robust, you know, mental health program, and I know not all newsrooms can afford it, but I would certainly urge any of the managers who are here, or for that matter, Pulitzer Center, to help, you know, fund people do things like that, to have, you know, sort of mental health. It doesn't have to be necessarily a really expensive thing, but just having managers and editors be aware of the toll can really help. You know, there's relatively straightforward things you can do. You can have a designated driver on your social media. If you know, if you're suddenly attacked, the best thing you can do is get off it and have someone else monitor it in case there are real threats that come up. You know, you do not necessarily want to delete the whole thing, but you know, your newsroom can help you on that sort of thing. And there are resources out there. They're blanking on them right now, but there are a lot of organizations that will help. And if you're a freelancer, you know, talking to something like the ACOS Alliance, which has done some fantastic work in helping freelancers get better contracts from their newsrooms, as well as to think through the whole issue of safety, both online and offline. And you know, PEN America, I think that's has the same sort of thing as well. So I would really just recommend that you look at all of those resources, and I would really urge newsroom management to take this seriously, because for both sort of moral reasons, it's the right thing to do for your staff, and frankly for liability reasons, because one day you'll get sued, and believe me, you don't want to get sued.
Obviously the cyber sex stuff is really good, that if you're online a lot, you're gonna, you have to be very mindful of your online presence. That's all the more important if you're marginalized, or if you're LGBTQ, or if you have prior names that you don't want people searching. But I think sort of more broadly, how to just sort of cope. In my work as a fact checker, I kind of was up to my eyeballs and like intentionally the worst stuff I could find on the internet. It's just sort of part of the job. And I know a lot of, that sort of intersects naturally with, I think, a lot of, LGBTQ journalists. We have to cover this type of stuff, I feel like, and I would just encourage people who are exposed to large amounts of like really hateful content or misinformation, or, just like the extremes. If you look at internet garbage for a living, like I used to, I would just encourage you, like the metaphor is to touch grass, but like really go talk to people who are nice and connect with local community. I was honestly never that involved in like the LGBTQ community, so to speak, despite the flag. And I live in San Francisco, which, it's like, we're what, 10% of the population here. It's insane. But I never saw much need until I was doing this work, where I was exposed to just a ton of vitriol all the time. And it was really refreshing to like step outside and like go to a business where I could get like a little pride cookie. It's like the silly things like that, that it can be a nice reminder, I guess, that, Twitter is not real life. So just, make sure to stay in touch. I promise that even in places that are not otherwise particularly hospitable, there's usually at least some community you can find. And to the extent that that is available online, that is some of what TJA does, that we're a place that we can all talk to each other and like process, even if there's not, even if you are the only trans person in your newsroom, for example. So just, stay grounded in the real world where not everyone is terrible all the time.
Thank you all for your responses to all of these questions. I'm going to go ahead and shift to audience questions now. We've been getting quite a few, and one I'm seeing is, do you all have any thoughts about the intersection of gender and race? This person says they're trying to learn the best way to responsibly report on Black trans communities in Atlanta. So what advice do you have for them?
I feel like you can't report on trans issues without reporting on race. Like they're intrinsically tied. And I feel like transphobia is really born out of racism. And I think that might sound confusing to a lot of folks, but I think that white supremacy is really the driver of so much transphobia, in that like we prioritize like a specific type of body, right? Like in that like the way that we think about the perfect woman in sports, for example, the way that we police runners, the way that we police intersex runners, right? All of that comes from the same place. And historically, we've policed Asian men as feminine, right? Or Black men as aggressive. And it all comes from the same place of needing to perform gender in a certain way and needing to perform race in a certain way. And it's impossible to report on one without the other. So, and I think a lot of us miss that and feel like we have to report on just gender or just race. And I feel like that's something even at the 19th we really struggled with. But I think when we dig into the intersection of that, like what we do is we open up like a whole world in which we see that like these two intersections are not at odds with each other, but like intrinsically linked everywhere. And so like that's why the people who I think are often championing white supremacy are also championing transphobia, and why those two things like so often collide. So yeah, I think it's critical to hold those two things together every time that we're reporting.
Gina, Graf, do either of you have anything to add?
No, I think Kate's the expert on this stuff.
Yeah.
That you've done a lot of great work.
So another audience question we have is, can any of you cite particularly good stories or approaches you've seen to this coverage, like model journalism?
Well, I mean, the Washington Post had, did with the Kaiser Family Foundation a huge survey of trans people. It's the first time I've seen that survey. I've seen anything even like that attempted, and I thought that was really, really helpful. And I thought, that's again, that's an exercise of enterprise journalism, right? They decided that it was worth their time partnering with someone, both the KFF and the Washington Post, to sort of ask these questions. To answer, questions that always get sort of hinted at in stories. And the stories like, well, nobody really knows how many there are. Well, now we've got a good idea, and they're interesting and I guess surprising bits of information that came out of that, including how small a percentage of trans identified people actually have medical interventions at all. So I mean, I think it's that's certainly one example of a story I think that did really, really good work, in pulling out, and there've been lots of good stories that sort of call out, what the genesis of a lot of these bills have been and how they've come together and so on. So, I certainly don't want to give the impression that it's a wasteland, because it's not a wasteland. But certainly, some of the less good coverage has sort of dominated the space and the debate.
The SF Chronicle here has been doing really good work. That they have, their public health reporters have somewhat pivoted since COVID to focusing on the trans community here, just because we are, I don't want to say disproportionate, but San Francisco is famously a very, has a high LGBTQ population, but that doesn't certainly insulate us from the broader news cycle. For example, there's been a lot of really attentive coverage to a recent killing of a Black trans person in San Francisco, and but like even more broad stories. Like I remember reading a piece by Aaron Alday not too long ago about, it was a really, really standard daily news hit on a new clinic opening to serve trans people. But it was really, really good that when I talked to her about it later, she was saying that, oh, I got to speak to people, and like initially they were kind of hesitant letting a cis person into this clinic to do a feature on it, but I made some really good sourcing and now I have all these other leads. And like, it was a really sort of basic journalism 101 piece of like, a new building is opening in town. Like, this is a story that could happen anywhere, but it was just really thoughtful and like really showed an attention to how it would impact like people who would receive medical services there and stuff. That, just like good daily beat reporting like that kind of stuff really makes a difference. So I've loved the Chronicle's work on trans stuff so far. I've yet to see a story that they've really whiffed. So trying to think of what else. Yeah, to Gina's point, it's definitely not a wasteland. I worry sometimes that we can seem like scolds, or that it's like impossible to write well about trans people. That's like absolutely not the case. If I could like leave us without any resounding emotions, it's that this is like very doable, and I want people to feel, as a style book person, I want people to feel empowered to have the tools to write about this community well, because like those stories are right there. They're so good. It's like, aside from like the obviously upsetting material impact of a lot of these things, as news stories, they're really compelling, that there's real tangible impacts from these legislation, for example. And just, I don't know, like I really want to encourage cis journalists, even who haven't covered this community before, to like learn about it and then do it. Like it's really important. And the last thing I want people to do is feel worried for lack, or like be too concerned about being on this like list of bad coverage that you don't take the dive, because it is doable. So much of this just comes down to journalism 101. And like I truly believe that even as important as it is to hire trans people in your newsroom, just to have a resource to lay up on, and also just frankly for normal like diversity reasons, like just because it's fair, like aside from that, everyone should be like, I don't know, I'm rambling, but it's doable. There are good examples. I won't clog with a lot, but there are a lot, I promise.
Sure, and please feel free to drop some of those links to those articles in the chat if you can. And then a more difficult question I'm going to read to y'all to respond to is from this audience member. It says, I'm the only trans person in my newsroom. There are bigoted communities who were organizing to protest queer events. And I was sent to go and cover the issue, specifically talk with the dangerous anti-LGBT protesters while they protested on site. Even though I felt unsafe, I couldn't not do it. I suppose my question is, how do we as trans people navigate covering these kinds of situations, but also maintaining safety, dignity, and sanity? Anyone who wants to go first?
I will just tell you that that's a, I mean, I don't know which newsroom you're in or who the editor is, but that is a straight up discussion with them, if not some kind of I leave aside the HR terminology. That's a basic safety issue, you know, no more than you would be, you know, and draw the analogies, right? I mean, you don't, you go to send a Black reporter to cover a white nationalist protest, or you know, a Ku Klux Klan meeting. I mean, you have to just ask yourself, what are the safety considerations just to begin with? And the newsroom has a duty of care. So I mean, I'm not being helpful because I know you're in a position, but you know, but I would certainly, you know, the people that need to take action are not you. The people that need to take action are the people that run that news organization. And I'm happy to yell at them if you want to give me their names. But that is just fundamentally not right. You don't say to somebody, you know, hey, by the way, we'd like to get some shots of inside a burning building. Would you go in and take some? And then we'll deal with your injuries later on. That's not how it works.
You know, and I would like to add to, sometimes some of us push ourselves to cover things that we feel like we can do better, or that we want to cover because they're important to us. Like, and I feel like I am guilty of doing that, or like putting myself in a position where I'm like, this is really important to my community and I could not do it because it's going to be really hard. But if I don't do it, it's going to be done by someone else. And I don't feel comfortable with the way it's might be written, or I feel like I could do it well. And I'll keep doing it and I'll keep doing it. But I want to say that, like, for all the struggles that we've been through in my newsroom at the 19th as a startup, the one thing that I do appreciate is I do have editors where at a certain point they'll go, I need you to stop. You cannot work past your hours, or I see you burning out, or I see that you're not okay, or hey, you've been reporting on something that personally impacts you, and whether you feel okay now or not, like, this is the time when you should take a break and step back and take some mental health time, or take some family time, take some whatever time, and you need to do that. And so newsrooms need to do that. And I know it's not a practice in our industry that is widespread, but it is necessary. And that is something that I think we have to start pushing for. And also, yeah, I would be happy to have that conversation with your newsroom also, which is to say, you deserve that, right? Like, mental health time, especially reporting on these stories, because it will exacerbate burnout really fast. And I think that there's an old way of doing things where we historically just pushed through, and especially in these times when we just come out of a pandemic, and I don't know that everything it's not possible to work like that anymore. It's just not sustainable.
One sort of positive experience that I had on the fact-checking team with AP is that even though a lot of things related to LGBTQ misinformation crossed our desk, I never felt like I was pressured to be the one to take those off. And often I volunteered. It was something I had some pre-existing knowledge of, but I was very lucky to work with a lot of cis colleagues who were aware of this possibility to, like, have it impact me more severely, and were willing to jump in or like tag team with me on assignments and like volunteered to that effect. You know, I wouldn't want, you know, again, I think it's, to Kate's point, we often, I think, run towards the fire in this industry, sometimes if that fire is specifically targeting us too. But like, I don't know, I think this is also just something that if you are in a newsroom and you're cis, but you have like trans colleagues, or even just broader LGBTQ colleagues in general, like, it always, I feel like, is appreciated. Like if you're going out to cover something in the field that like could be dangerous, like volunteer to come with them, or like at least offer to like help with institutional support. Oftentimes newsrooms are like very, I don't know, that you might not have a ton of resources to like shuffle new reporters around, but like just knowing that I could pass something off to someone if I felt like it was too much for me to handle was a big load off my chest. And it's something I wish that other reporters had available to them as support. So I hope that the other reporters in this room, or the call, like, will think about, like, if you see sort of that happening in your newsroom, like, offer to take an assignment, because like you can do it. Cis people can do this well, I promise. So yeah, that's my only 2 cents for this.
And we only have time for one more question here. So I'm going to end it on another difficult one. Sorry for that, but I think this is only going to become more and more common. So this question says, since Club Q and the shooting in Nashville, it seems the right has ramped up efforts to spread misinformation after mass shootings and search for evidence that a suspect is trans. How do you recommend approaching this or responding to an editor who's asking you to dig into or debate someone's gender identity after one of these events?
This is something that we specifically have been working on in the style book revision because it has come up. I mean, ultimately, I feel like a broken record, but a lot of this comes down to publish what you know and can confirm for a fact. That seems like very journalism 101, but it's the case here. That if it's unclear what the facts of a situation are, don't jump to conclusions or necessarily assume that like the first reports out of something are completely correct. Let me just read what I said. It might be necessary to delay specifically identifying someone's gender or their LGBTQ status or lack thereof if there's not clarity of that immediately, and the holding off to that effect and not printing something incorrect is dramatically better than having to run a correction that could be really damaging to a specific community. And to your point about broader misinformation, yeah, it's difficult. It requires some additional I don't want to say skepticism, but it's just something, it's good that just to be aware of it, like in the background of doing your reporting, that it's a risk, and that it's all the more important to just be really careful about verifying things before you publish them. The number one, like the very top of our new style book says, like the first thing is that you should always try and let people identify as, like, self-identify and explain to you what they are, or like reference what they identify as themselves if you need to identify someone. That should take precedence whenever it is even realistically possible, that someone's like, that's, I know that seems very basic, but that a lot of times that will sort of, if that sort of guides you, if trying to verify what someone says about themselves guides you, I think it can avoid at least some of the most egregious errors. But please, other people, step in if I have like characterized this poorly or something. Or not.
Gina, Kate, anything to add on this? Okay, well, thank you all for weighing in on all of these questions and for just taking the time today. I think this has been really insightful, and I'm going to hand it back to Michaela with the Pulitzer Center.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kallie, and thank you, Gina, Graf, and Kate, for participating in this today. I would definitely encourage all of our audience members to stay up to date on all of their work. They are all doing some of the best work in the industry around these issues. So definitely we can all learn from their examples. If you're interested in engaging with the Pulitzer Center a bit more, we host a lot of events that you can find here on our website on all sorts of topics, including AI, global health, Indigenous communities, climate change, and more. We also host recordings of our events, including this one, on our webinars on demand section. Included in this is a recent conversation that we had with some of our grantees in Brazil, India, the Philippines, and Turkey on reporting on international LGBTQ+ communities and the differences and struggles of journalists around the globe. And again, for those of you who are trans and non-binary, we would love for you to join us for a virtual chat with our Pulitzer Center senior editor. I'll share that registration link one more time here in the chat, and we will also email that out afterwards. Finally, for those of you who are able, we would appreciate you considering becoming a Pulitzer Center champion to keep supporting our work. Following the end of this, we will have a brief survey. We'd appreciate you taking the time to give us some feedback on how we can improve our events and make sure they're inclusive for all communities. So again, I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for everyone for attending. And that's it for today. Bye for now.